They have been called wise men, kings, astrologers. But who were the Magi from the story of Jesus' birth? In the Gospel of Matthew, a group of people described as Magi travelled to meet an infant Jesus and present him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Matthew is the only Gospel to include the visit from the Magi, and the author tells us very little about them. So I called upon Dr Eric Vanden Eykel, who literally wrote the book on the Magi, to help us figure out who these mysterious figures were. Let's start with the Magi in the book of Daniel. Eric, Magi or Magos is a Greek term. Does it feature in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible?
I was actually very surprised when I started my research because I was expecting that I would find the term Magi all over the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in fact, I only found it in one place. I found it in the book of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, the Magi are sort of advisory figures to the king. And so they are the people that the king calls on when he has the strange dream, and he wants them to help him understand why he's dreamed what he's dreamed. And in the Greek translation of Daniel, Daniel himself is counted among these sort of groups of which the Magi are sort of one subset. So they're sort of these advisory figures who have kind of connections perhaps to the divine, but also the ability to find significance in things that regular people like us can't understand, like dreams.
So in Daniel, the Magi are a subcategory of a type of professionally trained advisors who can interpret dreams. But the Magi also feature in other Greek literature.
We get scattered references to this term Magi throughout Greek literature, but it's really in Herodotus that they become kind of consistently recurring characters. And so in Herodotus, I look at the way that they are really attracted to political power. So again, in the sort of advisory figure to kings. And so you do have kings who are calling them when they've got strange dreams or when they don't understand something that's happened. And the king will call the Magi in to kind of help out. But also in Herodotus, you have these stories of the Magi who are politically manipulative. So, they'll see a vacancy on the throne, and there's a story of, one Magos putting another Magos on the throne, and then they sort of pretend that he's king for a while.
That's the story of Gaumata, a Magi who pretended to be the son of Cyrus the Great. After said son was murdered, Gaumata ruled until his advisors discovered the lie and assassinated him.
Just like in Greek Daniel, in Herodotus, you have Magi who are very much located in royal settings, whether that is to kind of help whoever's in power or to usurp whoever's in power.
In Plutarch, the Magi are also deceptive. Alexander 18:6 reads that Darius was encouraged by a certain dream, which the Magi interpreted in a way to please him, rather than as the probabilities demanded. So the Magi were often political advisors who were on occasion self-serving, trying to gain or preserve power, but they also had ties to religious practices.
But also in Herodotus and Plutarch, you get the Magi as religious professionals, and so not just diviners who can predict dreams, but you get them as people who perform sacrifices and other rituals and chant and intercede on behalf of people to the gods.
The ancient Greek biographer Diogenes tells us that the Magi followed a Persian teacher named Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra. They only wore white and offered prayer and sacrifices to their gods.
They're sort of a combination of a religious professional who also serve a political function.
What is clear is that in ancient literature, there was no single definition of what a Magi was. It could be several different things.
The best example that I can think of in a sort of English context is the term lawyer, right? If you say a lawyer is walking up to my house, well, that's the start of a story that could go a number of different ways, depending on whether you've done something illegal, or whether there's somebody out to get you, or whether one of your relatives just died and that lawyer is coming to deliver, news of a great inheritance or something. The term lawyer in our context is very, very similar, I think, to that term magi in the ancient world. It really, how that term is understood just depends on the person who's hearing it.
So how did Matthew understand the Magi? Were they Zoroastrians, priests, or were they professionally trained wise men in the ways of the Babylonians, such as Daniel?
The Magi in Matthew are finding significance in a star that they see. So they're interested in astrology or something of that nature. They come from the East, although Matthew doesn't tell us anything else where they're from. They're just from the East. So it's like really, really broad. Persia probably being the most likely place that Matthew is thinking of when he talks about the East. But the East also seems to kind of function as a kind of cipher for that mysterious land out there. We also then learn that, just like in Herodotus, that these magi have the ability to interpret dreams. And in this case, they're interpreting their own dream. But also in Matthew, that doesn't make them unique, because Joseph also has a dream that he's able to understand, right?
The Magi are probably most remembered for bringing infant Jesus 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. While people have tried to find hidden meanings in each of these gifts, the thing that they have in common is that they were expensive.
So it's tempting to say, oh, look, they're bringing gold and then it's expensive incense and then this expensive fragrance, myrrh. So therefore they must be wealthy. I tend to kind of err on the side of they're not necessarily wealthy, they're just generous. Because they're either wealthy or they've sold everything that they own in order to buy these gifts, right? And there are other instances of people bringing tribute, royal tribute.
In the Greek translation of Psalm 71, the author writes about foreign kings who come to honor a new king of Israel. Kings of Tarsus and the islands will bring gifts, and kings of the Arabs and Sheba will bring gifts. And in the Greek translation of Isaiah 66, all those from Sheba will come bearing gold. They will bring incense and will announce the good news of the salvation of the Lord. So in Matthew, the Magi are royal advisors that come from a mysterious faraway land. They help the author of Matthew in trying to portray Jesus as having a kingly status. Interestingly, much like the Magi in Greek literature, the Magi are portrayed as deceptive. Herod is described as being infuriated that the Magi had tricked him.
They probably didn't set out to deceive Herod, but they ended up doing that anyway. And it's almost as if deception is in their very nature, right? Like that's what you would expect a magus to do, is to deceive a royal figure.
And this all helps to explain how we got the descriptions of the Magi as wise men and astrologers. But the popular Christmas carol, We Three Kings, describes them as kings. For the origins of this idea, we need to look at early Christian interpretations of the Magi.
They become kings very, very pretty early. I mean, within a couple hundred years of Matthew, they're sort of these royal figures, and I think that probably what gets that started is the value of their gifts, right? That is sort of a one of the things that kind of contributes to, well, they must have been very wealthy.
There's a very early Christian writing which portrays the Magi as 3 kings who bring their armies to meet infant Jesus.
That's the Armenian gospel of the infancy, and it's wild, right? And they show up with tens of thousands of troops, and they camp outside Jerusalem.
So the Christmas carol didn't invent this idea?
That song is participating in a long tradition of interpreting these as kings.
Unfortunately, in early Christian literature, the Magi were also reinterpreted to promote anti-Jewish sentiments.
That is one of the most unfortunate uses of this story.
An example of this is found in John Chrysostom's homilies on Matthew, where he portrays the Magi as having converted from barbarians to followers of Jesus. Let us also follow the Magi. Let us separate ourselves from our barbarian customs. He later encourages his readers to leave the Jewish people behind. Therefore, likewise, leave the Jewish people, the troubled city, the bloodthirsty tyrant, the pomp of the world. He portrays the Magi as Gentile converts and the Jews as worldly and unenlightened.
It's not just that they are good Gentiles, it's that they are often Gentiles who are actually very wicked, but they acknowledge that they need to be liberated from their wickedness. And so that story develops as well, especially in patristic authors of, these figures are wicked, they're almost demonic, and then they come to Jesus and they're healed from all of this. Whereas the implication being, well, Herod and his people are also equally wicked, but they don't repent. The Magi become, in a lot of patristic literature, there's this focus on their conversion.
By portraying the Magi as wicked Gentiles who underwent a kind of conversion experience, early Christian authors were implying that they were far superior to the Jews who did not convert to follow Jesus.
One of the things that I want to be very clear on is, is it the case that Matthew imagines these Magi as Gentiles? Maybe. But that's certainly not the most interesting thing about them for Matthew. So if Matthew wanted to refer to them as Gentiles, he could have, or something else, if he wanted to just highlight that they were non-Jews, he could have called them, the ethnoi or whatever, the people, he could have used that designation if that was his point. But he didn't. He chose this very, very laden term to refer to them. And so if they are Gentiles, that is, according to Matthew, the least interesting thing about them.
It's also unclear what the Magi's exact interest in Jesus was.
There's a word, the Greek word, that is used to describe what they do when they get to Bethlehem, proskuneo. Sometimes means worship, like, bowing before a deity, but it often in Matthew just means bowing. And so, bowing is a sign of respect. And I think that's probably closer to what's going on in Matthew, is that, again, these are figures who are paying tribute to the rightful king. They're not necessarily worshiping him as a deity. But yeah, Matthew certainly doesn't have any sense of them, or if he does have a sense of them converting, or taking on new religious identity or anything like this, he doesn't say anything about it. He just sort of, leaves it unsaid.
So what can we say about the Magi in the Gospel of Matthew? In some ways, they function very similar to other Magi in Greek literature. They are advisors to royalty, dream interpreters, and astrologers. However, there is no sense of self-interest or seeking power for themselves that we see in other ancient literature. They come from a distant land to pay respect to the newborn Jesus, whom they describe as the King of the Jews, but the true extent of their attentions, abilities, and wealth remains shrouded in mystery. It's this ambiguity that allows them to still fascinate readers today. A special thanks to Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel. I will leave links to his book, The Magi, in the description. Thanks also to our patrons and members who make these videos possible. Consider supporting the channel for a few dollars a month to make scholarship like this accessible to a wider audience. My name's Lachlan, you've been watching Tablets and Temples, where we explore ancient history and religion. I will see you in the next video.